A federal jury returned a verdict on Friday on behalf of 4 New York police officers accused of falsely arresting a man on drug charges, rejecting the man's claim that he was detained so that the officers could earn overtime pay. The verdict, which came in the case of Hector Cordero, 59, also foreclosed the possibility of a broad judicial examination of the practice, known for decades as collars for dollars. Mr. Cordero was arrested in October 2014 on charges of selling 2 Ziploc bags of crack outside the Bushwick bodega where he worked as a cashier. When the police took Mr. Cordero into custody, they found no drugs or drug paraphernalia on him and the charges were dismissed within 5 months. Mr. Cordero ultimately sued the officers, claiming they had concocted the grounds of his arrest and put him in a holding cell in the 83rd Precinct Station House for no other reason than to justify filing for a total of 22 hours of overtime. Last year, the judge in the case, Jack B. Weinstein of Federal District Court in Brooklyn, issued an opinion setting up an unusual structure to decide Mr. Cordero's suit, which also included claims that the city might have known about and quietly tolerated. Officers making false arrests to boost their income. Judge Weinstein ruled that if any of the officers was found liable at the first trial, a second would be held to determine what the city knew about the practice and what, if anything, it had done to prevent it. In preparation for a possible second trial, the city filed sealed records about the use and abuse of police overtime in the years leading up to Mr. Cordero's arrest. But given the verdict, it remains uncertain if those records will ever be made public. In response to the court's specific question, the jury resoundingly rejected the plaintiff's claim that he was arrested to generate police overtime, said Nicholas Paolucci, a spokesman for the city's law department, which represented the officers. In an email, Mr. Cordero's lawyer, Gabriel Harvis, wrote, "We are disappointed with, but accept, the jury's decision." Even in losing, Mr. Cordero maintained his dignity. Mr. Harvis had told the jury that Mr. Cordero was never searched for drugs before he was handcuffed and taken to the station house. No interviews were conducted with witnesses, Mr. Harvis said, and none of the officers looked for drugs inside the bodega, the JNC mini market on Irving Avenue. It wasn't about fighting crime that day, Mr. Harvis said. It was about getting paid. Philip DePaul, a lawyer for the city, had a very different version of events. He told the jury that after the exchange took place outside the mini-market, the officers arrested the buyer, Matthew Ninos, and found that he was carrying a small amount of crack, a crime to which he eventually pleaded guilty. 20 minutes later, when the officers arrested Mr. Cordero, they found that he was carrying $584 in cash crack from the buyer, money from the seller, Mr. DePaul said. That's a drug deal. The officers on trial all belong to one of the city's elite anti-drug teams known as a Special Narcotics Enforcement Units, and the courtroom testimony gave a glimpse into their operations. One of the officers, Hugo Hugasian, testified that witnesses were never interviewed in Mr. Cordero's case because no corroboration was needed. The officer had seen the deal himself. He also said that no one looked for drugs in the mini-market because the deal took place on the street and the unit was constitutionally banned from searching the bodega. On Wednesday, testimony shifted to the issue of overtime. Mr. Harvis noted that Mr. Cordero had been arrested around 1:30 p.m. and was at the precinct station house until almost 6:30 p.m. Then he was taken to Brooklyn Central booking. Officer Hugasian said he signed Mr. Cordero's criminal complaint at shortly after 8 p.m., which would generally mean that he was done with that day's part of the case. So why, Mr. Harvis asked, had the officer filed paperwork indicating that he stayed on duty until 12:25 a.m. the following day? Officer Hugasian said that he stayed after to voucher evidence and read intelligence reports to prepare for the next day's operations. Under questioning, however, he admitted he had never noted the extra work in his memo book. On Thursday, Mr. Cordero took the stand, telling the jury that for the 5 hours or so that he was locked inside the holding cell, no one ever told him why he had been arrested. He also said that Officer Peter Rubin, a defendant in the case, strip-searched him, a claim that Officer Rubin has denied. I was terribly depressed because I am a very honest person, Mr. Cordero said. Everybody knows me and knows who I am.